After the fall of Berlin and the collapse of the Third Reich, the Allied powers concentrated their efforts on identifying and capturing the National Socialist leaders. Among the detainees were not only high-ranking military commanders and political leaders, but also a particularly controversial group, the youths of the Hitler Youth. With their arrests, a troubling dilemma arose: what to do with the young people who had embraced National Socialism. These youths faced severe punishments in courts that left no room for ambiguity. The judicial proceedings highlighted the supremacy of the war tribunals led by the Allies, especially the Americans, in the task of eradicating any vestige of Nazism. Many faced brutal treatment, summary executions, or confinement in camps, being held responsible despite their young age. Baldur von Schirach, leader of the Hitler Youth, was tried in Nuremberg for crimes against humanity, sentenced to 20 years in prison. The construction of Nazi youth, indoctrination and manipulation. During the early years of the 1930s, Adolf Hitler and the National Socialist German Workers' Party took power in Germany with a set of clear and strategic objectives. Among them, ensuring the formation of a generation of the supposed superior Aryan race that would uphold the ideal of the Third Reich based on German domination. This was carried out through the recruitment of German boys, using the Hitler Youth, known as Hitlerjugend, as a key tool, which became a fundamental pillar of Nazi ideology. Although the existence of youth organizations with military or nationalist purposes was not new in Germany, Hitler managed to turn them into effective instruments of propaganda and indoctrination. These organizations had been small at the beginning of the 1920s, but the landscape changed significantly when Hitler took office as Chancellor in 1933. From then on, the movement grew exponentially, aiming to shape the minds of German children to turn them into obedient citizens willing to sacrifice themselves for the Führer and his vision of the German future. In 1936, enrollment in the Hitler Youth became mandatory for all children over 10 years old in Germany. By the end of that decade, millions of boys and girls participated in activities similar to those of the Scouts, although with considerably different purposes. Boys were prepared for military service, while girls, through the League of German Girls, were instructed in their role as future mothers and collaborators in the military effort from home. This system was not limited to extracurricular activities, but encompassed a comprehensive program of political education. In it, racial hatred, militarism, and absolute loyalty to Hitler were central elements. Indoctrination began at an early age. Children as young as 6 years old were enrolled in the League of German Youngsters, Deutsches Jungvolk, the youth branch of the Hitler Youth. This sought to separate them from values or beliefs that might contradict Nazi culture. Schools played a crucial role in this process, presenting concepts of racial purity and German superiority, as well as instilling negative images of Jews, communists, and other minorities considered enemies of the German people. The training offered by the Hitler Youth was not only ideological but also military. Boys were trained in the handling of weapons, combat strategies, and rigorous physical exercises that promoted brutality. This environment gave rise to a generation of boys prepared both mentally and physically for war, with little regard for compassion or empathy. For Nazi leaders, including Hitler, youth represented a malleable resource that could be shaped to idealize a superior Aryan, strong, relentless, and completely obedient to the regime's dictates. After the start of World War II in 1939, the Hitler Youth took on a more active role in the conflict efforts. They went from being primarily a propaganda and training organization to directly participating in the military machinery. The youths, influenced by years of indoctrination, were eager to serve their homeland, which translated into their integration into various war activities. They acted as communication assistants, firefighters, and factory workers, significantly contributing to the German war effort. As hostilities progressed and Germany suffered increasing setbacks, the German government began deploying younger boys in direct military roles. By 1943, the growing losses on the Eastern Front forced the recruitment of 16- and 17-year-old teenagers and even younger ones to join the regular troops. The situation worsened in 1945 in the last months of the war, when boys as young as 12 years old were sent to the battlefield. An emblematic example of this youth participation occurred during the defense of Berlin in April of 1945. Youngsters equipped with Panzerfausts, anti-tank weapons, were sent to fight against the Soviet advance. Most lacked adequate training to operate these weapons, but their ideological fervor drove them to fight for a cause they considered just. However, against experienced Soviet soldiers, the boys had no chance. Many lost their lives in these desperate efforts to prevent the collapse of the Nazi regime. While it is considered that members of the Hitler Youth were victims of Nazi indoctrination, many actively participated in war crimes. Several of them joined the Waffen-SS, the military branch of the Nazi Party, and played key roles in the persecution of Jews and other minorities. One of the most well-known units was the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, composed mainly of youths from this organization. During the Battle of Normandy in 1944, this division was responsible for war crimes, including the murder of Canadian prisoners. The prolonged indoctrination and rigorous training made these soldiers effective tools of the Third Reich. Many had deeply internalized the ideals of violence and brutality instilled over the years, leading them to commit atrocities against innocent civilians and prisoners of war in the name of Nazism. The crimes of Nazi youth, cases of war and atrocities. When World War II ended in Europe in May of 1945, the victorious Allied forces dedicated themselves to capturing and prosecuting those responsible for the crimes committed. With the collapse of the German command and the Third Reich reduced to rubble, the decision was made to ensure that those who had designed and executed the Holocaust faced justice. This conflict had witnessed unprecedented brutality, marked by mass murders, concentration camps, and the systematic massacre of millions of people. The need for justice was imperative, and the process of locating and prosecuting those responsible began immediately. When the Allies entered German territory, Nazi atrocities came to light. The liberation of camps such as Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, and Dachau revealed the extent of the genocidal acts committed under direct orders supported by documents. The mass graves and the testimonies of survivors confirmed that extermination had been a state policy. Faced with this irrefutable evidence, fundamental questions arose. Who would be held responsible, and under what legal framework would they be judged? The leaders of the United States, Great Britain, the Soviet Union, and France agreed to bring high-ranking Nazi officials to unprecedented military trials. Of these processes, the most well-known was the Nuremberg trial, which took place between 1945 and 1946. Nuremberg was a city devastated by bombings, but whose courthouse remained standing. Additionally, this place had a special symbolism, as it had been the scene of the great rallies of the Nazi regime. The Nuremberg trial was the first in history established by an international tribunal with the purpose of collectively prosecuting war criminals. In the main trial, 24 prominent figures of the Third Reich were accused of crimes against humanity, violations of international laws, and acts of war. Among the accused were high-ranking political, military, and economic leaders of Germany, responsible for the planning and execution of the conflict, the extermination of European civilians, and the systematic use of millions of people as slave labor. Key figures such as Hermann Göring, Rudolf Hess, and Albert Speer were accused of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and crimes against peace. However, the pursuit of justice was not limited to Nuremberg, as hundreds of thousands of people linked to the Nazi government also had to be held accountable. For example, Hermann Göring, head of the German Air Force and one of the most influential figures of the fallen system, became one of the most notorious defendants. During the trial, Göring showed no remorse for the misdeeds committed and openly defended the actions of Hitler's government. Finally, he was sentenced to death, although he avoided execution by committing suicide in prison. Among these defendants was a significant number of young people who had been part of the Hitler Youth. For the American forces, responsible for overseeing much of Germany after the conflict, thousands of teenagers had been tools of the Nazi regime, and therefore, addressing the fate of each of them represented a particular challenge. In the early days following the conflict, the predominant approach was strict responsibility. Those who had participated in mass murders, operated concentration camps, or used slave labor were quickly judged by military tribunals. The defense of propaganda manipulation or lack of emotional maturity carried little weight against the evidence presented. One of the most notorious cases was that of the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, which was mainly composed of former members of the Hitler Youth. This division, which remained loyal to Adolf Hitler until the end of the conflict, was involved in several war crimes, especially after the front broke in Normandy in June of 1944. Many of the soldiers of the 12th SS Division were teenagers and participated in atrocious massacres, such as the shooting of Canadian prisoners of war. The division, under the command of Kurt Meyer, was tasked with eliminating all detainees in the areas where these crimes were committed. Meyer, known for his fierce loyalty to the Nazi Party and his military aggressiveness, was one of those responsible for these acts. At the end of the conflict, he was captured by the Allies and brought to trial in 1945. In his defense, Meyer tried to justify his actions by arguing that his soldiers were only following orders. However, he also tried to dissociate himself from responsibility by blaming his subordinates. Despite his efforts, the evidence against him was sufficient to sentence him to death, although his sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. Meyer was released in 1954 after serving 9 years in prison. Another significant case was that of the members of the SS Totenkopfverbände, known as the Death's Head units, who were responsible for the administration of concentration camps. Among the guards of these camps was a considerable number of young people from the Hitler Youth who were recruited and became tools of the Nazi genocide. One of these individuals was Josef Clare, a young man who, although older than most of the accused, received a Nazi education and was a guard at Auschwitz. Clare actively participated in the mass murder of prisoners, including gas killings. Survivors of Auschwitz and other concentration camps testified at his trial, highlighting his ruthless attitude and involvement in the crimes committed in the camp. Clare was captured and tried in the Dachau trials, which focused on the atrocities perpetrated in the concentration camps. During his trial, testimonies about his behavior as an executioner and his lack of remorse were decisive. He was sentenced to death and executed in 1948. In another case, Heinz-Georg Linge, who was only 21 years old at the time, was part of Hitler's personal guard, known as the Leibstandarte SS. Linge was involved in the shooting of deserters and political opponents towards the end of the war in Berlin. Despite his youth, his unwavering loyalty to Hitler made him an active defender of his cause. The American military tribunal considered him a voluntary collaborator of the Nazi government and sentenced him to hang, with his sentence being carried out in 1946. However, not all young people involved in the Nazi regime received equally severe treatment. As the trials progressed, cases began to be documented where individual circumstances posed moral and legal dilemmas. Some of them had voluntarily participated in Nazi rallies and committed misdeeds, while others were forced to join the service or commit criminal acts under direct threats, including death. This difference between those who acted out of conviction and those who did so under coercion generated debates about the nature of guilt and the degree of responsibility that could be demanded of such young people. The handling of these cases highlighted an inherent complexity in the attempt to achieve justice in a context marked by massive indoctrination and totalitarian control. While some Nazi youths were sentenced to long prison terms or even executed for their actions, others received lighter sentences or were exonerated after considering the specific circumstances of their participation. These nuances reflect the difficulties the Allies faced in trying to balance the need for justice with a partial recognition of the realities of the Nazi system, which had used young people as instruments to perpetuate its goals. A distinctive feature of the Nuremberg trials was the nature of the charges presented. For the first time in history, international law recognized the concept of crimes against humanity and declared genocide a prosecutable offense. The evidence presented in court included detailed documentation on the operation of concentration camps and harrowing testimonies from survivors. The tribunal was composed of judges from the United States, Great Britain, the Soviet Union, and France, who worked together to establish a legal precedent that would prevent these crimes from going unpunished. The verdicts at Nuremberg were varied. 12 of the accused, including Göring, were sentenced to death. Others, like Albert Speer, received long prison sentences for their role in the Nazi war machine. Some were acquitted, although this did not absolve them from social condemnation for their connection to the system. The trials laid the groundwork for the development of modern international law and established a standard of moral and legal responsibility for war crimes and genocide. Over time, the trials evolved to address the legal and ethical issues raised by the participation of young people in Nazi crimes. In the early 1950s, hundreds of individual cases continued to be processed, reflecting the Allies' persistent concern for establishing equitable justice. These legal proceedings were not only a crucial step in holding the Nazi regime accountable, but also set a precedent for future international justice efforts. The legacy of Nuremberg endured as a milestone in the fight against the impunity of war crimes and genocide. The United States military tribunals, justice, and moral dilemmas. The Nuremberg trials, often considered a key milestone in the pursuit of justice after World War II, did not represent the end of the process, but the beginning of a series of judicial proceedings aimed at holding those involved in the crimes of the Nazi machinery accountable. In addition to the main trials conducted in Nuremberg, the Allies, especially the United States, organized numerous smaller trials under the structure of the American military tribunals. These proceedings covered not only the prominent leaders of the regime, but also thousands of people at intermediate and lower levels, including young people involved in the activities of the Third Reich. These trials, which took place in various regions of Germany, focused on prosecuting individuals for various types of war crimes. Among the accused were concentration camp administrators, those responsible for massacres on the battlefields, doctors who developed methods of mass extermination, and soldiers who committed brutal acts. While the Nuremberg trials focused on the main culprits, the American military tribunals sought to cover a broader spectrum, from leaders in war production to ordinary officials and soldiers. One of the most significant challenges these tribunals faced was handling the young people indoctrinated in Nazi ideology, who had committed excesses during World War II. In some cases, they committed terrible acts, such as the execution of prisoners of war or the operation of gas chambers, all to defend the Führer and National Socialism. However, the fact that many of them were born and raised in the context of the Nazi dictatorship complicated the assessment of their culpability. They were trained to obey orders without question and did not have the opportunity to decide whether to adhere to the ideology of the Third Reich. American prosecutors faced the dilemma of how to judge them. On the one hand, they were perceived as victims of systematic propaganda that shaped their beliefs from childhood. On the other hand, many actively participated in war crimes, making them responsible before the law. Most had grown up believing in the supremacy of the Aryan race and were willing to sacrifice themselves for the Third Reich. This context generated debates on whether they should be treated as voluntary accomplices or as individuals manipulated by an oppressive system. The United States military tribunals, governed by Allied Control Council Law No. 10, were tasked with charging them under accusations of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and crimes against peace. Although the general rules were clear, the tribunals showed flexibility to adapt to the particularities of each case. Special attention was given to young people from units such as the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, known for their devotion to Hitler and their participation in events such as the execution of Canadian prisoners of war during the Battle of Normandy. The systematic indoctrination to which they were subjected from childhood, which prepared them to blindly obey and despise non-Germans, posed a challenge for judges and prosecutors. Although some youths were treated leniently due to what the authorities had instilled in them, those who committed especially atrocious acts faced severe punishments, including the death penalty. Among the accused were also those who played roles in concentration camps, such as guards in places like Dachau. During the trials, it was established that all people who participated in the operation of these camps were responsible for their actions, regardless of their age or rank. These smaller trials took place within a broader context of reconstruction and denazification of Germany, where re-education and dismantling the ideological structures of Nazism were fundamental priorities. Although they did not achieve the notoriety of the Nuremberg trials, the proceedings led by the United States played an essential role in the pursuit of justice and understanding how the Nazi regime managed to transform young people into obedient instruments of its extermination machinery. This complex moral panorama was exacerbated by external pressure. The tribunals not only judged the actions committed by the Nazis, but were also aware of the need to ensure political stability in a Europe devastated by conflict. The international community expected the trials not only to punish the guilty, but also to serve as an exemplary lesson to prevent future similar crimes. Therefore, the tribunals adopted a severe approach, sentencing many defendants to death or long prison terms, regardless of their age or the nature of their involvement. A representative case of this situation was that of Heinz Petri, a 19-year-old member of the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend. In his trial, Petri defended himself by claiming that he acted under orders and that his participation in the crimes was the result of deep indoctrination. However, the court did not accept this justification, given that the nature of the events he was involved in was so extreme that it was deemed Petri should be punished for his contribution to the perpetration of those acts. Finally, he was sentenced to death and executed. Although cases like Petri's were the norm in American military tribunals, not all trials followed a similar pattern. In some cases, the courts took into account the personal circumstances of the accused, considering whether they had been victims of threats or had attempted to resist the Nazi regime. This flexibility allowed some young people, despite being implicated in those atrocities, to receive lighter sentences, while others faced much harsher punishments. On the other hand, the global context in which these trials took place also played a crucial role. With the onset of the Cold War and the need to rebuild Europe, the Allies faced the difficult task of balancing justice with geopolitical interests. Although the responsibility for the crimes committed by the Nazis was undeniable, the governments of the victorious powers were also interested in stabilizing the region and containing the spread of communism. This situation led to some defendants, especially the younger ones, receiving more lenient treatment after serving part of their sentences. Some were released after a few years in prison, which generated criticism about the impartiality and consistency of the tribunals. Criticism of the American military tribunals centered mainly on the accusation that these trials were more about seeking revenge than a true process of justice. Many argued that the younger Nazis, due to their education in a totalitarian regime, were not fully aware of the magnitude of their actions. Moreover, the fact that they were products of a system that taught them to act without questioning orders diminished their individual responsibility. From this perspective, the punishments imposed were considered excessive and were seen as a way to make an entire generation pay for the crimes of the Third Reich. However, other voices maintained that, regardless of their age and indoctrination, the accused were responsible for what they had committed, and that justice should prevail over any humanitarian considerations. The issue of justice in the context of war trials continues to be a subject of debate. The question of whether justice should seek retribution or rehabilitation remains relevant, not only for post-war trials, but for any judicial system dealing with individuals who have been shaped in a context of hate and violence. Despite the controversies, the trials of young Nazis marked a break with the impunity that characterized the totalitarian regimes of the time and set a precedent in the fight for justice after war crimes. From this angle, the trials of Nazi war criminals were perceived by many as a justified measure to hold Adolf Hitler's government accountable for its unprecedented atrocities. At that time, a clear and simplified view of the facts prevailed, in which the Nazis were seen as the villains of a story where the victory of the Allies represented the restoration of justice. The majority of the population in the Allied nations strongly supported sentences that included executions and imprisonments, as the horror of the Holocaust and the war crimes committed during those days remained very present in the collective consciousness. For many, punishing the responsible was necessary to prevent future resurgences of fascism, without considering too much the nuances of the situation. The concept of justice, of course, has evolved over time, and contemporary reflection on the trials of young Nazis has focused more on the socio-psychological issues accompanying human behavior under a totalitarian regime. Instead of focusing solely on the actions of individuals, current studies seek to understand how propaganda and indoctrination systems can influence people's decisions, especially when they are so inexperienced. The Nazi youths, many of whom were subjected to years of propaganda and military training, are now seen as a clear example of how responsibility within a totalitarian system can be complex and nuanced. Today it is common for post-war trials to be analyzed in a broader context, taking into account the factors that influenced the decisions of the accused. While it is recognized that the responsibility for the crimes committed during World War II should not be ignored, it is also discussed whether the severe punishment they received was the most appropriate. Some argue that imprisoning for life those who were products of a totalitarian system may have been a disproportionate reaction, without considering the psychological and social circumstances that led them to act as they did. This debate continues to be relevant today. While the trials of young Nazis were seen as necessary at the time, it has been recognized over time that the complexity of the situation deserves a more detailed analysis. Questions about justice, guilt, and deserved punishment remain topics of discussion, especially in the context of a history marked by ideological manipulation and decisions made in times of conflict. The fact that they were treated the same way as adults, despite their age and the influence of their education, raises questions about the ethical consistency of the decisions made during that period. Heritage and reflection, psychological impact, and international reactions. During the post-war trials, the psychological consequences of Nazi indoctrination were evident in many of the accused from the Hitler Youth. The youths facing charges of war crimes were often surprised and bewildered by the accusations against them. They had grown up in an environment where they were taught that their actions were not only acceptable, but morally correct. For them, the behavior that was being reproached was nothing more than the fulfillment of duty, a behavior that only the outside world considered as murder. This large-scale conditioning generated confusion and bewilderment, and many of these accused showed clear signs of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, a mental condition characteristic of those who have experienced prolonged psychological abuse. The defeat of Nazi Germany not only represented a political and military defeat, but also a profound destabilization of the principles on which they had been raised. The dissolution of the ideology that had formed them left many unable to comprehend the moral implications of their actions. They, who for years had been trained in the belief that their actions were justified by a patriotic duty, could not conceive that what they considered morally correct was now regarded as a crime in the post-war tribunals. Nazi indoctrination had transformed their minds to such an extent that the distinction between right and wrong was almost unrecognizable to them. One of the most striking characteristics of the trials was the difficulty of the accused in conceiving that their actions were illegal or wrong. The Nazi regime had completely shaped their notions of morality, and many of the defendants defended their actions by arguing that they were simply following orders. This argument became a central element of the defenses presented during the trials, where the majority of the accused youths stated that their participation in the crimes was the product of blind obedience to their superiors. For them, acting according to the will of National Socialism was not only natural, but an obligation. The indoctrination to which they were subjected had turned them into almost automaton-like figures, incapable of questioning the orders they received. Defense lawyers faced a significant moral dilemma in representing them, as many were involved in extremely serious crimes such as murder, rape, and torture. They did not seem to be developing individuals. Although the actions committed by these defendants were of an atrocious nature, the lawyers tried to present them as simple and innocent victims of the system that had formed them. Despite the nature of the crimes, the defenders argued that none of the accused youths were fully responsible for their actions, as they had been ideologically manipulated from childhood by the Nazi government. The psychiatric studies presented during the trials showed evidence of how they had been subjected to systematic brainwashing, which made it difficult for them to make independent moral decisions. One case that clearly illustrated this problem was that of Erwin Metz, a former member of the Hitler Youth and soldier of the SS. He had been stationed at the Buchenwald concentration camp and participated in the execution of prisoners. Despite the abundance of evidence against him, his defense argued that Metz had been a product of the Nazi regime's brainwashing and could not be held fully responsible for his actions. Experts who testified in his defense stated that the defendant was emotionally disconnected, a common symptom in individuals who had experienced ideological trauma. Although he was eventually convicted, the case underscored the widespread confusion that many of these youths experienced, as they did not fully understand the gravity of their actions. Another relevant case was that of Hermann Klemm, a 19-year-old who, as a member of the SS, participated in massacres in occupied Poland. During his trial, his lawyer argued that he was just a child when he was indoctrinated by Nazi ideology, suggesting that youths like him were trained to be killers from an early age. This case illustrated a critical point about the free will of the accused. Many of their contemporaries, although guilty of horrendous crimes, could not be seen as the same individuals who committed those acts without the deep conditioning to which they had been subjected. Defense lawyers faced a moral challenge in having to represent individuals who, while responsible for their actions, had been formed and exploited by a totalitarian system. Public opinion was divided. On one hand, many demanded severe punishment for them, while others, including psychologists and ethics experts, questioned whether they should be considered directly as adult war criminals, given the brainwashing they had undergone. The confusion in the minds of the young showed that many of them were not fully aware of the magnitude of their actions. In the context of the post-war trials, public opinion in the United States was firm in its support for the Allied efforts to bring Nazi war criminals to justice. The Nuremberg trials, widely covered by the media, offered the American people the opportunity to understand the magnitude of the infractions committed by the Nazi regime. As more details about the Holocaust, forced labor camps, and systematic genocide became known, indignation among citizens grew, who considered it appropriate to punish the leaders and followers of Nazism, regardless of their age. Most Americans saw the Hitler Youth as a key piece in the Nazi horror machinery, tasked with fighting to the last breath for the Third Reich and committing atrocious crimes. For many, the image of indoctrinated youths blindly following Hitler's orders was an affront to the spirit of freedom and the democratic principles so defended by the Allied powers. However, some legal and intellectual circles in the United States questioned the fairness of judging Nazi youth. Human rights advocates, lawyers, and writers argued that they had been victims of Nazi ideologization and propaganda, and that they belonged to a perverse system that turned them into obedient tools of a totalitarian state. They argued that judging minors in the same way as adults responsible for war crimes did not take into account the moral and psychological circumstances of the accused, as many of them had been raised in an environment where violence and hatred were considered norms. Additionally, these critics believed that the United States might be using the post-war tribunals as a form of revenge, rather than a fair process that considered the conditions in which they were educated and manipulated. Despite this, opinions against prosecuting them were relatively minor, as most of American society saw the trial as a necessary continuation of efforts to eradicate the remnants of Nazism and fascism. In Germany, opinions on the trial against those youths were divided. The nation, devastated after the fall of the Third Reich and aware of the crimes committed during the regime, experienced a mix of denial and suffering. Many Germans did not want to face the horror of the Holocaust and considered it unfair to judge the young people who had been part of the oppressive system, as they had been indoctrinated from an early age and had no choice but to serve the government. In many cases, especially with members of the Hitler Youth, there was a sense of sympathy towards them, as they represented a generation whose fate had been manipulated by Nazi propaganda. For many, judging them was a way to reiterate the suffering, and it did not seem appropriate to treat them as adult wrongdoers. However, there was a faction within German society, particularly those who had opposed the Nazi government, that supported the trial as they believed that justice should prevail over the circumstances in which they found themselves. Over the years, public perception of Nazi youth changed, especially in Germany. In the 1950s, when Germany began to rebuild and integrate into the Cold War, the focus shifted from revenge to reconciliation. Many of the early prisoners, former Nazi children and teenagers, were released earlier than expected to stabilize Europe. In the 1960s, a new generation of Germans began to question the past and analyze the involvement of Nazi youth in all of it. As investigations were conducted and the crimes committed were discussed, the view of the young people who participated in the Third Reich began to change. This change was part of a broader process of justice, guilt, and memory that took place in post-war Germany. The new German generations of that time began to reflect on the actions of their ancestors, leading to a re-evaluation of the participation of Nazi youth in the regime and a process of assuming moral and historical responsibility. This process of historical and war reflection led to the formulation of new international regulations, such as the reforms to the Geneva Conventions. These focused on the protection of children and other innocent people trapped in armed conflicts, although it was also recognized that minors could be forced to participate in hostilities. As the lessons learned from the treatment of the youngest Nazis were assimilated, the United States military gradually adopted a policy of reintegration rather than imprisonment for child soldiers, recognizing the social and psychological impact that war had on those involved.